This is what I was going to cover today. So we're going to talk about making web APIs with the new features that are in Asp Net Core 5. And I'm going to show you a default project. We're going to go through the tutorial, and it's the exact same tutorial Microsoft has. I can show you the web address. Then I'm going to teach you how to use Postman, Swagger, something called HTTP REPL, and something called the REST extension. Has anybody used all four of those? I'll take that as a no. So hopefully you get something new out of this. So this is not earth-shattering what I'm going to do. I'm basically using basic Microsoft documentation. So if you go to docs.microsoft.com, Asp Net Core, I could probably paste that into the chat here. Basically what we want to do is go and look for APIs. Now, what I find curious is they have a section called tutorials, and under there they have web API apps. Okay. Then they have a separate section called Web API Apps, and guess what? It has tutorials. So you wonder which one you're supposed to go to. But we're just going to start with the basic stuff, and that's this one. And it's not really fancy. I'm going to refer to this back and forth, but hopefully you can see my screen carefully, and then I'm going to try and position Visual Studio so that we can sort of keep the instructions here and keep the code here. Technically what I want to do is I want to start a new instance of Visual Studio. So let me do that. And we will make a new project. So I'm going to make a web application. So I'm going to create a new project. And I'm going to make an Asp Net Core web application. Then I'm going to say next. And I have to give it some name. So let's call it PDN CodeCamp to do, because this is actually about to-dos. You have to be, well, when you do something like this, it's actually going to screw me up. But I'll do it anyways. Because if you don't name it exactly what they have in the tutorial, some of the code gets mixed up. All right. So when you make an ASP.NET web app, you're going to choose which version of ASP.NET Core you want. And since I want the latest, greatest, where they've added all these new features, I'm going to use Core 5.0. And I could make a web app, a web API app, an empty project where real clever people can like combine all sorts of techniques. And then finally, they have some templates here for working with React and Angular. Now, what's really important is a new change on the right-hand side. Do you see this thing here that says enable OpenAPI support? Well, that is new to the latest version of Visual Studio and also .NET Core 5. And what that's going to do is it's going to add from a template the proper lines of code that make it easy for you to work with APIs and test them. And we're going to be using something called Swagger and Swashbuckle. They're just fun things to say. You could use Swagger and Swashbuckle in earlier versions of .NET Core, but you had to read a lot of documentation and add a lot of things manually. Now they've integrated it all, and that's part of what I wanted to show you. So let's create this. Okay, and now we have a new application. And let's see what it made for us. It made a startup. And a couple things I wanted to point out in the startup. Notice that they're adding a service called SwaggerGen. And SwaggerGen is going to be what gives us the fancy interface to test our web APIs. they've also added two things in your configure method. You're saying use Swagger and use the Swagger UI. And when you use the Swagger UI, notice it's going to have a endpoint with a JSON file. And in this JSON file is where you put instructions on exactly how you want Swagger to operate. And this is optional. It does all the stuff for you by default. Okay, now that we have that established, let's look at program. What does program do? Nothing unusual. When you run APIs, it just starts, it says use startup, and it says startup. What is startup? Startup is the name of the class, startup.cs. And then that runs the configure and it sets up all your stuff. Okay, so we have in our template a controller. So just like in MVC, you're going to use controllers to present APIs. So the controller is going to be decorated with an annotation called API controller. Secondly, it's going to have a route. Does anybody know what controller means if it's inside of square brackets?
Controller name.
Right. So that's a little funny because it's a controller name, but we have a weather forecast controller. But if you weren't sure about this, the actual name of the controller is weather forecast. So what this means is it's gonna return, or it's gonna present itself in the URL as weather forecast. And then inside weather forecast, it has a method called get that is going to use an HTTP get. And basically there's a little fancy code here that goes out and gets a bunch of random temperatures and creates some fun stuff for you to look at. Okay, so when this returns, it's going to return back a type called weather forecast. Well, they give you that in the template. They give you a type, and that's just a standard class called weather forecast, and it has a bunch of members, date, time, ints, and strings. So what does it look like when we run this? We'll do a Control F5, and this is going to bring up the actual. See, it took these spaces and put the underscores for you. Notice below that it says Swagger v1 Swagger JSON. That is actually the JSON file that defines how Swagger is supposed to work. Okay, so since I had in my controllers, since I have a single, come on now, where's my controller? There it is. Okay, since in my controller I have a single thing called get, then over here they have a get. And since the name of the controller is the route, we have a route called /weather forecast. So when I click on get, you'll see down here that it says this is what it would look like if you ran it. So let's try it out. When we try it out, we click execute, and it actually runs the code on our left, and that generates a random list of temperatures. Pretty easy to do. When you run this, notice that you can return it in text, application JSON, text JSON, and then down on the bottom, it says, what is the schema? The schema actually shows you the types of the fields inside the JSON that's returned. So your program that you write as a client front end would be able to read this information and decide what kind of type was needed on the front end to consume the API. So it's a pretty easy system. Now, hopefully, if you've been making APIs at all in .NET, you've embraced Swagger and Swashbuckle. I've been using this for many years, even before .NET Core. And all of the clients I work with, we always set this up because it's sort of self-documenting. Did you guys know that this Swagger interface here is totally customizable. Is anybody aware of that?
Yeah, somewhat customizable, yeah.
Somewhat, okay. I would agree with you. Yes, somewhat customizable. And there are, I'm not going to go through the details of that. We don't have enough time today, but you can basically fill out some XML structures and make a couple other configuration changes. And what I've done for clients is I made it so that their logo appears in the upper left-hand corner. And then it'll say like the company name, and then it'll say like, you know, here's our invoice repository. And then it would have like maybe 10 or 20 methods, and it would explain in each method exactly how you were supposed to use it. So you wouldn't have to actually sit in a meeting and tell the programmers how to consume the API. That's your goal, not to be able to talk to people. All right, so no questions on that. That's a real basic API. So I'm going to stop that for a moment. I'm going to go back here and I'm going to say, well, what did they really want me to do in the tutorial? Well, let's see what's going on here. It explains the tutorial and it says there's a launch URL. Did you know that in properties in your solution, there is an important file called launch settings? In launch settings, it sets up things like your launch URL. Since it defaults to a launch URL of Swagger, when I start the project, it automatically displays the Swagger screen. We probably don't want that. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace that, as they suggest in the tutorial, with API to-do items. Okay? If I then run this, what's going to happen is it comes up and says nothing. Well, to-do items wasn't enough. Excuse me. To-do items is actually the name of a different application. So what we want is we want weather forecast. I think it was weather forecast. I forget. All right. Well, that didn't work the way I wanted to, but that's okay. So the reason it's going to confuse me is because they want you to make a new project called to-do item, and it's okay. I'll work around it. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a class, and to do that, what we have to do is make a folder. So we're going to come up here and say add a folder, and the folder is going to be called models. It doesn't have to be called that. It's just a useful convention that a lot of people use. And inside there, we need to add a class. So we're going to add a class, and we're going to call this to-do item. It's upper lowercase, that's important. So we put that in here, and then basically we're just going to copy this part of it in, and now we have a to-do item. So that was pretty easy. Okay, now we're going to use Entity Framework nonsense. Well, it's not always nonsense. It actually works very well. But to use Entity Framework in this application, we have to add a bunch of NuGet packages. You can either do this from the command line, or you can do it from the NuGet package manager. So I'm going to go down to the NuGet package manager, and we can actually do that over here. And we're going to grab two packages. We want to be running with SQL Server. So we go over to Browse, and we say, I want to use SQL Server. So we select SQL Server, and we install it. So that one's done. And then the other one we need is something called in-memory. Now, if you haven't worked with this, in-memory allows you to basically run SQL Server in memory without actually saving a file. It's good for testing purposes, but obviously it's not going to save it anywhere to disk, so your data starts fresh every time you start the website. Okay, so now that those are added, we can create what's called a context. That is an entity framework thing. So entity framework is going to allow us to work with a database. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another class. And we're going to call this to-do context. And basically what we have to do is we have to have this using statement. And that would allow us to use entity framework. Oh. Hold on a second. We're in the middle of a family thing going on. Mother's in the hospital, so that's why I'm getting phone calls. Okay, so what we need to do here is we need to take and make this derived from DV context that allows us to read data from SQL Server, and this is what it's going to do. So let's put this method in here. So what that's going to do, it's going to create this thing called the DB context, and we're all set to go. Now that's the code you need. Okay, everything's fine. So what you're going to do is anytime you start working with Entity Framework to feed your APIs, you need to go to Startup and you have to tell it what you're doing. Now, we have a thing called models, but it's in this namespace. So we're going to do the to-do models. We're going to load Entity Framework Core. And then what we have to do over here is we have to tell it we want to create a database called to-do list. So that's in configured services. So we go down to configure services and we paste that in there. And that when it starts up, that will actually create our database that we can then feed. Next thing we want to do, and this is part of the magic of the new Visual Studio enhancements. We're going to create a controller. Now we could do all this by hand. We could copy things from a Reddit example, or we could add something called a scaffolded item. So scaffolded items come from, there's a whole library of them, but you can see them here. And what we want is an API controller with actions. So we say, add that baby. And then it says what class we want to use. Well, we know we have something called to-do item. And we know that we have a context called to-do context. And we want to make a controller called to-do items controller. So when we click add, it's going to go write all that code for us. And that's going to be useful because when you see how much code it actually creates. And there you go. So you see up in the solution, we now have under controllers, we have a to-do items controller. And what it does is it uses the models. In the controllers, it's going to make a route. It's going to make this an API controller, just like I showed you with weather forecast. It inherits from controller base. Does anyone have any idea why you would inherit from controller base and not controller? I'll take that as a no. Controller itself is designed to handle MVC views. So it has a lot of extra methods to be able to get an action result of type view and display it on the screen. We don't need that. We want something slimmed down. So controller base is actually the thing that controller inherits from. And controller base knows how to do stuff like work with web requests, return back 404 errors, 301 errors, any kind of error you need. But it doesn't know how to do views. So when you make a API, you're always going to use controller base. Then you have things like you got to get your context. That's how you get your data out of Entity Framework. And then you have some basic stuff. You have a get. So here we're going to get the to-do items. That's going to return back all of the items. This one's going to get an item, and then it's going to grab the ID. And you see that little thing here. It passes a parameter of ID, and that ID is going to be an integer, and you're going to do a find async to get the actual item. Going down here, you can do a put. So a put would allow you to do changes. A post would allow you to make an item. And finally, you can do a delete. That's pretty easy. And they also have one that says, does the item exist? All right. So does this stuff actually work? Let's do a Control F5. It would be good if I'm on Visual Studio when I do that. And we're back. Darn it. There's nothing to look at. Well, remember, if you watch what I was doing, when we did Swagger, Swagger still exists. I didn't remove it. So I can still go in here and see all my items. I can still run my weather forecast. It runs fine. I never removed it. However, I now have something new where I can get all my to-do items. When I get my to-do items, I get a single item. Excuse me, I get the response body here of nothing because I didn't make any. So how am I going to make a to-do item? Well, you got to post to make a to-do item. So how am I going to do that? Well, here's an example. So it says, let's try it out. And it says, here's the structure. And basically it read the information from Swagger, and it says, these are the fields that are required to do a post. So I know I want to do a post, and technically I don't have to assign the ID. I bet it'll do it for me, but let's try it anyways. Let's do an ID, and let's say we have to record video. So we'll do things that have to do with this conference. And we're going to say, that's pretty true because we've actually done a lot of them. Let's execute, see what happens. And when we execute, it returned back a success. Okay, see the code 200? And then it says, this is basically what it gets back. So it came back and it said, well, I didn't assign the ID of 0. I assigned the ID of 1 because the database wants me to do an identity key starting at 1. So what would happen if I would do a second one of these without the ID? Would that work? Because it seems like it should. And we should probably schedule a fall camp. And we did not do that yet. So let's execute that. Aha. So down here, you'll see that it actually says that's an ID of 2. That's working out pretty well. Now that I have some post, what should get do? Aha. It returns all of them back in an array. So now we have 2 items, one's true and one's false. That's interesting. Okay, so that is the value of automatically adding this thing called Swagger. Technically, the term they use in the business is OpenAPI. And this is not only used in Microsoft products, it's used in many different web languages and frameworks. So that's one way to look at things. Now, did you know that when you do the get, it gives you the request URL? What happens if I put the request URL right in the browser? Ah, it works. The browser doesn't know to show it as JSON, but it does work. If I go into the browser tools and go into the network tab and run this again, then when it runs, it actually shows me a formatted layout with the data. That's pretty useful. A lot of people like to use a tool called Postman to do all this stuff. If you've never used Postman, it's a free download. They have like a pro version that you could pay for. And let's see if we can get this to work. So notice that we have up here a 44304. So let's go up here and get 44304 API to do item. I hit a send, and that's, so I'm now talking to my API from Swagger and from Postman. Can Postman do a post? Seems like it'd be easy to do. Let's go down here to post. When I'm posting, I need to have a structure. So what we need to do is email attendees. I'll send out an email this week. That is not complete. And let's see, we have up here 44304 to do items. We're going to post. That looks good to me. Let's try it. Aha. So I did a post, and that created a third item called email attendees. If I go back to Swagger and execute, you'll see the third item appears here. And of course, if I go back and do a get, it appears here. So we could do posts to add new items. We can do gets. We can also do puts. Now, if you're going to do a put, we probably want to change an existing item. So let's change record videos, and let's make that a 1. And then we're going to make this an ID :1. And let's say record awesome videos. That's the only kind we do here. And we'll say that's pretty true anyways. Let's leave it true. Let's see how that goes. Well, that's not very useful. I got back a 1. Interesting. Okay. Let's go back over here and execute again. And you'll see that the 1 basically returned back a success. And what that means is we actually took an existing record and we changed its values. That's what a put is for. I don't have an example right here, but there is another method you can use called patch. I could try and do a patch. What a patch does is allow you to update specific fields and not supply the entire source record. So, you know, for certain kinds of work, that's more secure. What do you think is going to happen when I try and do a patch here? I got a 1. And but you have to be very careful. Do you see that little message there? Method not allowed. Because our template code that we have when we scaffolded the controller does not have a way to handle an HTTP patch. We could add it, we just don't have it right now. So for that reason, the framework automatically returns a friendly message saying you can't use that, you can only use certain things. Okay, interesting. So basically, that is how APIs work. So I showed you a default out-of-the-box API, an API that connects to a database and does updates. That's pretty good. Now, of course, I'm probably running behind schedule, but I already showed you Postman, and I showed you how to use Swagger. Next thing, JavaScript. I have another version of this already running, so I'm going to stop this one. And I'm going to go to the version that's already running. And that one is called To Do API. So what did I do in this one? I took basically the exact same API. However, I changed launch settings. And you'll notice that I no longer have a launch point, a launch URL. If I don't have a launch URL, it'll default to index.html based on IIS defaults. Well, where would that come from? I have to make a folder called www.root. In there, I can put an index.html. There's an HTML. Okay, and it has a really awful example of CSS, no colors whatsoever, and it has some wonky JavaScript, which I'll explain in a moment. The other thing you need to do is you need to go to your startup file, and in your startup file, you need to do this. Use default files, use static files. This allows you, the default file allows you to do the index.html as a default. And the static files allows you to do the CSS, the JavaScript, things like that. In other words, your support of www root. What happens if I run this? It goes to index.html. And it already has some data that I made earlier this morning. Let's add another thing here. Let's see. Well, we're going to have to make dinner tonight, so let's do that. And then let's see. Tomorrow I got to go see my mother at the hospital. There you go. You can tell what's on my mind. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Now, notice that this is 44,385. Okay, if I go back to Postman and I change this to 44,385 and we say to do items and I do a get, see, I get all the information in this other application. That's pretty useful. Okay, so let's go and do, let's pretend we're going to edit the, let's see, add members. Let's say I'm done with this. So what you could do here is you could go into the network thing. Now watch what happens when I click add member. I check it off and hit save. Aha, what did it do? It called API to do items. And, oh, I'm sorry. It called this URL here, see, to do items, and notice it did a put, and the put returned to 204, which is a happy code. Okay, and what's the response? Apparently it didn't show me the response, and that's okay. So what that did is that the put did the update, and then the JavaScript issued an immediate to-do item with a get to refill the list and redraw all of the items. I don't have time to explain all the JavaScript to you, but I'll show you one or two things. How does it do a get item in, it does what's called a fetch. So in JavaScript, you can do a fetch. You can call a URI. The URI, see it's up here, it's hard-coded as a string. And then it returns back promises. So it says, wait for a response. If I get a response, then go get the data from the response. Assign that to the display items object. And if you throw an error, do this. And then below, it has functions to add items. So notice this one's doing a post. When it does a post, it has to add the item. When it does a delete, it has to know the ID, and then it has to call with the ID in the URI. And then there's an update. The update is doing the put. So basically, the JavaScript here is almost identical to what we saw in Entity Framework in C#. They're both going to process the data in a similar way. So it's a pattern you can get used to pretty easily. Okay, so that gets us to the point where we've seen JavaScript. Now, I don't have enough time to go through the entire last demo, so I'm going to show you what was already finished. Okay, so what I did is I used VS Code instead of Visual Studio to basically do the same, and we're going to stop that one. And we're going to do the same thing in Visual Studio Code. Now, what we did here it has a properties, it has a launch settings. So this is very similar. Oh, for Christ's sake, that's not supposed to be in that area there. It's supposed to be over here. Okay, let's try that again. There you go. Okay, so what you'll see here is I set the launch URL to do items. I have the exact same code in startup. This one is actually doing Swagger. It's doing the in-memory database just like we did before. Then it has in the models the to-do item. So this looks almost identical to what we saw in Visual Studio. The difference is how it was built. And if I can show you, I don't want to run all these commands, but down in my terminal, and you'll understand real soon why there's multiple. But notice I have 3 terminals running. Okay, so PowerShell are commands that I typed while I was editing in Visual Studio that allowed me to add things to my project. So what I did up here is I said, I want to trust the certs on my local machine. That's just a technicality. There's another command I did before this that actually created the project from the templates, and you use a .NET command to do that, because in Visual Studio Code, there's no file new project. You just go down to the terminal and you type in some command line things, and it creates things for you in the current directory. So I did that to create the sample application. Then if you follow along here a little bit, I'm trying to see where else I did commands. So here I installed the Asp Net Code Generator. I updated the code generator, and then I made a controller. See this thing here? So remember when I scaffolded the to-do controller in Visual Studio? This command line in Visual Studio Code does the exact same thing. It wrote all the code for me, and what that does is that creates a controller. It tells you here where it puts it, and then if you go in here, it's the same controller with the same code that I showed you in Visual Studio. So, all well and good. And just to prove this works, we'll do a Control F5. And you look and say, huh, this doesn't look useful. Well, does it have a Swagger? Apparently it does. But this one's running on port 5001. And why is it running on 5001? Because that is what was in the launch settings up here for the to-do item. Now remember, typically when you're in VS Code, you're not in IIS, you're going to be running what's called the Kestrel environment. And these are the instructions for Kestrel. Does it work? Well, let's try it. We're going to try it out, execute, and say, huh, there's nothing in there. Well, can we add some items to it? We've done this before today. So let's go back to post, and we have to add an item. So try it out. And I'm focused on dinner. So let's run this one. So we execute that. It comes back and says, yes, we made an item called make dinner. And if I go back to the get and I try that out again and execute it, you'll say that we now have one item. So came out of Visual Studio Code, works exactly the same as Visual Studio did. But there's 2 cool things I want you to see. To do that, we should probably let's add one more item. So let's go back to post, and we want to save the videos, and we didn't save all of them yet, but we're getting close. So let's execute that and make another one that we want to post videos to YouTube. And Chris Gomez is working on that. And whoops, Chris is going to put these on your tube, not YouTube. Okay, so now we have a couple items in our to-do list. So we got 3 of them. Excellent. Okay, now there's 2 little tricks that I think are worth you learning. The one trick is an extension that you add called the REST client. I really like this. I use this a lot with my clients. So this is an add-on to Visual Studio Code that allows you to manage REST requests from within Visual Studio Code. It's a very popular extension, 1.4 million downloads. How does it work? Well, I made a file, if I can find it, called, wait, I don't want to, let's see, I don't need this right now. I don't need that one. Do item. Come on. I hope I saved that file. I may have to make a new one. Darn it. All right. Well, let's do this. So file, new file. Doesn't matter what you call it. We're going to change the type. Whoops. My mistake. We're going to change the type of this file to HTTP. And this is something that the extension adds for you. Okay, and if you want to save this as part of the project, what you would do is you could Control S, and we're going to save this. I don't know why I put it under properties, but I'll just call this rest.http. Really doesn't matter where you save it. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do a get. Now, the get normally does this. So I'm going to copy that out of Swagger, and I'm going to put that there. Now, it automatically recognizes, the extension recognizes this is a URL that could be an API call. So if you click send request, there's my answer. So that's the same thing that I have in the to-do API in Swagger. That's useful. But what's really nice, this is right in Visual Studio Code. I can do things like expand and collapse. I get my color coding. I can also take and save this. So if you're a developer and you want to show like other developers what your structure looks like for your API, you can just save this and then send it to them, or you can tell them how to use this tool and they can test it on their own. Next thing, how about if we want to do a post? Well, let's think about that. To do a post, I'm going to have to look down here, and a post, well, that's interesting. A post is going to sort of do the same thing, but it needs a certain format. So to get the format, what I need to do is I need to go back here, and they show you an example of a post right here. And this is another trick I wanted you to see. We'll do both of these. Okay. And what we're going to show you is that if you take and separate with 3 pound signs, like a comment, and if you have the right URL here, so we want to do items. Okay, and then this one's going to post to do items. Okay, so to do this one, we wanted to have a name, and let's say end conference. That's going to happen in an hour. And we want an is complete false down here. Okay, that looks good. All right, so let's run the top request. Okay, that worked. Let's send this request. Did that work? Yes. Since we specified an ID, it only returns back a single item from our database. It's not in brackets. It's not an array. And we also stipulated that we wanted to use HTTP 1.1. that might matter in your case. Now, suppose you want to make a new item called end conference. Well, in that case, I have to do a post. But when I do a post, it's going to require a content type and a body. So the REST client automatically looks the lines underneath the post statement, and it lets you run them. And you'll see when I hit that post, it made a 4 called end conference. And if I go back to the first one, you'll see that adds values. So this gets very interesting. Now I can make an HTTP file that has all of the URLs that I want to call in a certain order, and I can go and click through them and explain to somebody exactly how a series of tasks would happen as your front end hits your back end. You can also basically use this, there's a lot of things REST client does, but you can use this for automated testing as well. Okay, I'm really out of time, but I got to show you one more thing. So can I want to hear from somebody. Can I have 2 more minutes?
Yeah.
Excellent, good. The last thing I want to show you is there's a new thing in .NET 5 called HTTP REPL, R-E-P-L. So what is HTTP REPL? REPL stands for Read, Eval, Print Loop. So if you're doing stuff in like Unix environments, very common to work with REPLs. Okay, so there is a tool that you can install called HTTP REPL. And I already installed it. And when you run it, you can use it to connect to an environment. So right now, see how I'm connected to localhost 5001 API to do items? Watch what happens when I do an ls. Aha. So this is a command line way of interacting with these things. And I bet I could do a put. Now, this is interesting. So don't worry about the 6 here, but I'm going to do a put. Watch what happens.
Hey, Bill?
Yes.
Great stuff. Look at the time, though.
Yeah, yep. I'm going to end it. I told you I wanted 2 minutes. You only gave me 1. Please give me another minute. Okay, so 1 more minute. Can't spell. Okay, now what this did is it opened up a new VS Code. Now watch what happens when I save it. Aha, it actually ran. So if I now do a get, so the point is that you basically have this new terminal window in VS Code that does all the things that the REST client does, or the Swagger does, or you could do it with your browser tools. So that's my story. Glad you could join me.